The groan came first. It was a low, guttural sound, the noise of a behemoth stirring unwillingly in its sleep. Not mechanical, like the ancient HVAC system that rattled the walls of the pediatric ward, and not human, like the chorus of coughs and whimpers that was the constant soundtrack to Sarah Jenkins's 12-hour shifts. This was a deeper sound, a structural sound, the sound of something giving up. Sarah's head snapped up from the IV drip she was adjusting. Her eyes, shadowed with the familiar fatigue of a double shift, darted to the ceiling. Above the bed of 8-year-old Leo, a boy whose world had shrunk to this single room for the past 3 weeks, a hairline crack she'd reported last Tuesday had blossomed into a grotesque spiderweb. A fine powder, the dust of forgotten decades, drifted down like a malevolent snow. Leo, small for his age with a thatch of brown hair and eyes that held the weary wisdom of a chronically ill child, looked up from his comic book. "What was that noise, Sarah?" Time seemed to warp, stretching and compressing all at once. The other kids in the 4-bedroom were stirring, their parents looking around in confusion. The fluorescent light above Leo's bed flickered, buzzed, and died. In the sudden gloom, the only sound was the rhythmic beep of Leo's pulse oximeter and that low, grinding groan, which was now getting louder, punctuated by a sharp crack. Sarah didn't think. She didn't weigh options or calculate risks. Her training, her instincts, her very soul forged in the crucible of underfunded hospitals and endless patient advocacy screamed a single, primal command: protect the child. "Get under the bed!" she yelled to the others, her voice cutting through the rising panic. But there was no time for Leo. The web of cracks was visibly widening, sagging, pregnant with a weight it could no longer hold. She moved. 1 second, she was by the IV pole. The next, she was launching herself over Leo's small, frail body. She twisted midair, her back facing the ceiling, and wrapped her arms around him, pulling his head into her chest. She squeezed her eyes shut, her mind a blank slate of pure, unadulterated instinct. She smelled the faint, clean scent of his shampoo and felt his small, terrified gasp against her scrubs. The world exploded in a concussion of noise and force. It was a dry, deafening roar, like a landslide in a sealed room. The impact on her back wasn't a sharp pain, but a colossal, crushing weight that drove the air from her lungs in a single, silent scream. Plaster, lath, and ancient, gritty insulation rained down, a brutal avalanche that buried them both. The force slammed her head against the metal bed frame, and for a moment, the world dissolved into a kaleidoscope of bright, jagged stars. Dust filled her mouth, her nose, her lungs. It was thick, choking, tasting of decay and neglect. The weight on her back was immense, pinning her down. She could feel the sharp edges of broken wood digging into her shoulders and the dull, throbbing ache that was already blooming across her spine. But beneath her, she felt a small, trembling vibration. "Leo? Leo?" she coughed, her voice a raw, dusty rasp. "Are you okay? Talk to me, buddy." A muffled sob was the only reply. "It's okay," she gasped, fighting for breath against the weight. "It's okay. I've got you. It's over." The roaring had been replaced by a ringing in her ears, but slowly other sounds filtered through. The screams of the other parents, the frantic footsteps of her colleagues, the hospital's alarm system, a shrill, piercing wail that sounded, to Sarah, like a final, belated admission of failure. She had filed 3 separate maintenance requests for that ceiling in the last 2 months. The first was flagged as low priority. The second was under review. The third had received no response at all. Her supervisor, Brenda, had pulled her aside just last week, her lips a thin line of impatience. "Sarah, your job is patient care, not structural engineering. Focus on the charts. Let the facilities people do their jobs." Sarah had wanted to scream, "What if they're not doing their jobs?" But she hadn't. You don't make waves at Northgate General. You just learn to swim in the filth. You learn to patch up crumbling infrastructure with gauze and goodwill, to stretch single-use supplies, to soothe terrified parents with reassurances you know are half-truths. You learn to smile while your heart is breaking for the children trapped in a system that sees them as entries on a balance sheet. A hand grabbed her shoulder, pulling at the debris. "Sarah, can you hear me?" It was David, another nurse. "Leo," Sarah managed to choke out. "Check Leo first." Hands were everywhere now, lifting chunks of plaster and splintered wood off her back. Each piece they removed sent a fresh jolt of pain through her, but the crushing weight lessened. Finally, enough was cleared for her to move. She pushed herself up, every muscle screaming in protest, and looked down. Leo was staring up at her, his face streaked with tears and dust, his comic book clutched to his chest like a shield. He was trembling, covered in a fine white powder, but physically untouched. Not a single scratch. He looked from her face, where a thin line of blood was trickling from her hairline, to the cavernous, gaping hole in the ceiling, then back to her. In his wide, terrified eyes, Sarah saw not just fear, but a dawning, reverent awe. She had shielded him. The ceiling had fallen, and she had caught it. The aftermath was a blur of controlled chaos. In the emergency room, Dr. Miles barely looked at her as he stitched the gash on her forehead. His focus was on his tablet, dictating notes in a clinical monotone. Patient is a 34-year-old female, RN at this facility. Lacerations and contusions to the back and shoulders consistent with blunt force trauma. Superficial head wound. No signs of concussion at present. He was describing a car accident, a set of symptoms, not a person who had just willingly become a human shield. "Does it hurt?" he asked, a perfunctory question as he dabbed an antiseptic wipe on her back that made her hiss in pain. "It's fine," she lied. 2 police officers were waiting for her behind the curtain. They were young, their faces impassive. Their questions were a sterile checklist. "Can you state your name for the record?" "Sarah Jenkins. And you were the nurse on duty for patient Leo Martinez?" "Yes. Our initial report states you positioned yourself over the patient prior to the structural failure. Can you confirm that?" Structural failure. The same term the doctor had used. It was also bloodless. "A piece of the ceiling fell. I covered him." The taller officer made a note. "And why were you in that specific location at that time? Were you aware the ceiling was unstable?" The question hung in the air, thick with insinuation. It wasn't, "Wow, that was heroic." It was, "Did you contribute to this problem?" Sarah felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. "I was with my patient, and yes, I was aware. The entire ward is unstable. I've filed reports." The officer's eyes flickered with something annoyance, disinterest. "We'll need copies of those reports," he said, before moving on. "Thank you for your cooperation, Miss Jenkins." They were done. They turned and left, their job complete. There was no acknowledgement of her shredded back, her throbbing head, or the terror that was only now beginning to recede, leaving a chilling sense of dread in its wake. The true interrogation began an hour later. A nurse she didn't know told her that Mr. Davies wanted to see her, not in his gleaming office on the top floor, but in a small, windowless conference room in the administrative basement. The air was stale and smelled of old paper. Mr. Davies was a man who seemed assembled from a kit of corporate parts: tailored suit, silvering temples, an expensive watch, and eyes that held the flat, placid emptiness of a shark. He wasn't alone. A woman in a severe pantsuit sat beside him, a leather-bound portfolio open on the table. She was the hospital's legal counsel. "Sarah," Davies began, his voice a smooth, polished stone. He didn't ask how she was feeling. "Thank you for coming. This is Miss Albright. We need to discuss the incident." "The ceiling collapsing on a child, you mean?" Sarah corrected him, her voice sharper than she intended. Davies' smile didn't reach his eyes. "Indeed, a most unfortunate structural event. We need to ensure that the hospital's narrative of this event is clear and consistent. For liability reasons, you understand. The narrative is that the ceiling fell. I was there." "Yes, about that," Miss Albright interjected, her voice crisp and devoid of warmth. "Your presence in that spot? Your intervention? It complicates things. It draws a great deal of attention to a situation that is, shall we say, sensitive." Sarah stared at them, bewildered. They weren't seeing a hero. They weren't even seeing a nurse. They were seeing a complication, a loose variable in a damage control equation. "We understand the local news has been calling," Davies continued, steepling his fingers. "We must insist that you do not speak to them. All communication will be handled by our official press liaison. It is imperative that we present a united front." "A united front?" Sarah's voice cracked with disbelief. "You ignored 3 reports. That ceiling should have been fixed months ago. A little boy almost died." Davies' expression hardened. "Casting blame is not productive, Sarah. We have processes. We have budgets. Things are not as simple as you seem to think. What is simple, however, is our media policy. Any unauthorized contact with the press is a violation of your employment contract." It was a threat, wrapped in the silken glove of corporate policy. As she left the room, her head spinning, she ran into her supervisor, Brenda. Brenda was a stout woman whose default expression was one of pursed-lipped disapproval. There you are, Brenda snapped, not a hint of concern on her face. Because of your little drama, we've had to relocate all of Ward C. It's a logistical nightmare. You have no idea the paperwork you've created. My little drama? Sarah whispered, aghast. Brenda, the roof caved in. And now we all have to pay the price, she said, turning on her heel. Your next rotation is nights, effective tomorrow. It was a clear punishment, a petty show of power. Sarah walked out of the hospital into the gray afternoon, every part of her aching. Her back was on fire, her head throbbed, but the deepest pain was a cold, hollow feeling in her chest. She had done the right thing, the only thing, and the system she had given her life to was treating her like a criminal. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a text from Leo's mother, Maria. I don't have the words, you are a guardian angel. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Below the text was a link to a local news site. The headline read, Hero nurse shields sick child as hospital ceiling collapses. The photo was grainy, taken on a cell phone, showing her standing over Leo amidst the debris, her face smudged with dust, her posture fiercely protective. Tears welled in Sarah's eyes. One person saw her. One person understood. For a moment, in the face of the administration's cold fury and Brenda's petty tyranny, that one small acknowledgement felt like enough. The next morning, Sarah woke up in her small apartment to the symphony of her own aches. Every muscle in her back and shoulders had seized up, a painful reminder of the 100+ pounds of plaster and wood she'd absorbed. She swallowed 2 ibuprofen with lukewarm coffee, the news story from last night a distant, surreal memory. It was just a small, local piece. By now, it was yesterday's news, buried under a dozen other city happenings. The hospital administration would get what they wanted. The story would die, and she would be shuffled off to the night shift to be forgotten. The world felt gray, unjust, and exhausting. She was scrolling through her phone, ignoring the buzz of nursing forums, when an unknown number from a New York area code flashed on her screen. Probably a scam call. She let it go to voicemail. A minute later, it rang again. Annoyed, she answered. Hello? Am I speaking with Miss Sarah Jenkins? The voice on the other end was female, professional, and impossibly crisp. This is she, Sarah answered, cautious. Please hold for Julian Croft. Sarah nearly dropped the phone. Julian Croft? The Julian Croft? The architect whose face graced the covers of Time and Architectural Digest? The man who built shimmering museums that looked like sails catching the wind and philanthropic hospitals in developing nations that were masterpieces of sustainable design? It had to be a prank. A moment of silence, a faint click, and then a man's voice, warm and resonant, filled the line. Miss Jenkins? This is Julian Croft. I hope I'm not disturbing you. Mr. Croft, she stammered, sitting bolt upright on her couch, a jolt of pain shooting up her spine. No, not at all. I'm just surprised. Please call me Julian. I saw the article about you this morning. A friend sent it to me. The photo is quite remarkable. His voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent of genuine emotion in it. What you did was, well, it was extraordinary. An act of pure, unhesitating humanity. Sarah didn't know what to say. Praise from a stranger of this magnitude felt unreal. I just did what anyone would do. I assure you, Miss Jenkins, that is not true. Most people freeze. You acted. There was a pause. I was also struck by the background of that photo, the state of that room, the decay. It made me angry. Sarah let out a short, bitter laugh. Welcome to the club. I run a foundation, he continued, his voice shifting from appreciative to purposeful. We build things. Specifically, we rebuild things that have been broken by neglect. My own daughter spent 6 months in a pediatric ICU when she was a little girl. It was a miserable, soul-crushing place, much like the one in that picture, I imagine. It's a subject that is personally important to me. Sarah's heart began to beat faster. She had no idea where this was going, but a fragile, impossible hope was beginning to dawn. I don't want to waste your time, Miss Jenkins, Croft said, his voice firm and clear. Here is my proposition. My firm, through my foundation, would like to offer our services, pro bono, to completely redesign and rebuild the entire pediatric ward of Northgate General. Furthermore, I have donors who are prepared to fully fund the construction. There will be no cost to the hospital. We want to turn that crumbling, depressing ward into a state-of-the-art facility for healing, a place of light and hope. Silence. Sarah held the phone to her ear, certain she had misheard. She was waiting for the punchline, the catch. Pro bono? Fully funded? It was a fantasy, a multi-million-dollar miracle delivered over the phone. "Are you serious?" she finally whispered, her voice trembling. "I have never been more serious in my life," Julian replied gently. "But we can't do it without a champion on the inside. Someone the public trusts. That's you, Sarah. If you will have us, we want to help you finish the job you started when you threw yourself over that little boy." The ibuprofen hadn't touched the pain in her back, but suddenly, she didn't feel it anymore. The gray, unjust world exploded into vibrant, dazzling color. Tears streamed down her face, but they weren't tears of pain or frustration. They were tears of overwhelming, unbelievable joy. This was it. This was the solution. Not just for the cracked ceiling, but for everything. For the flickering lights, the broken equipment, the despair that hung in the air of that ward like a disease. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Oh my God, yes." Armed with the impossible hope of Julian Croft's offer, Sarah felt a renewed sense of purpose. She secured a meeting with Mr. Davies, requesting his and the board's time for an urgent and highly beneficial proposal. She walked into the same soulless conference room from before, but this time, she wasn't a frightened employee being reprimanded. She was an emissary of a miracle. She laid it all out for Davies and the 3 board members present: the offer from a world-renowned architect, the pro bono design, the full private funding from Crofts Foundation. She spoke with passion about what a new ward would mean for the children, for the staff, for the hospital's reputation. She expected, at the very least, stunned silence, maybe even gratitude. What she got was a cold wall of suspicion. "Let me be clear," Davies said, leaning forward, his placid mask replaced by a look of undisguised panic. "You, a nurse, solicited this offer after the incident?" "I didn't solicit it, he called me. He saw the news story and wanted to help." The oldest board member, a man named Henderson whose family had been patrons of the hospital for generations, scoffed. "It's a publicity stunt. Croft gets to look like a saint, and we're left looking like incompetent fools who can't maintain our own facility." "But you are incompetent," Sarah blurted out, the words escaping before she could stop them. "The ceiling fell on a child." The room went frigid. Miss Albright, the lawyer, cleared her throat. "What Mr. Henderson means is that accepting such a high-profile gift would be a tacit admission of negligence. It opens us up to a universe of litigation. It is, from a legal standpoint, untenable." "This is a gift horse we cannot afford to look in the mouth," another board member muttered, clearly worried about the optics. Davies seized on the dissent. "It's not just the legal aspect. We have existing relationships with local contractors, union agreements. This isn't as simple as letting some celebrity architect come in and play with his building blocks. There are processes." Processes. The word he used to justify neglect. They weren't seeing a solution for sick children. They were seeing a threat to their control, their carefully managed image, and their cozy, back-scratching vendor contracts. They spent the next 20 minutes burying the miracle under an avalanche of bureaucratic red tape, ending the meeting with a promise to take the proposal under advisement. Sarah knew what that meant. They were going to kill it. Her next stop was with Julian Croft's associate, a sharp young architect named Ben, at the city planning office. Ben unrolled the preliminary sketches, beautiful renderings of a ward filled with natural light, colorful murals, and family-friendly spaces. The city official, a man named Peters whose gut strained the buttons of his shirt, peered at the plans over his glasses. Peters was a known golf buddy of a hospital board member. No," Peters said after a cursory glance. "This won't do at all." Ben was taken aback. "Sir, these are just preliminary concepts." "Doesn't matter. Your proposed atrium here," he said, tapping a magnificent glass ceiling, "would violate subsection C of the 1987 Sunlight Ordinance regarding public right-of-way shadows." "The ward is on the 4th floor," Ben said, confused. "It won't cast a shadow on any public street." "Rules are rules," Peters said with a smug finality. He proceeded to find fault with everything, from the number of electrical outlets to the type of non-load-bearing drywall specified. He was a human wall, constructed of nonsensical regulations and petty power. They left with a list of 24 fabricated violations, each one a paper cut designed to bleed the project to death. The hospital's counterattack came 2 days later. Sarah was called back to the basement conference room. This time, only Miss Albright was there. She slid a thick envelope across the table. "Sarah," she said, her tone suggesting they were old friends. The board appreciates your enthusiasm. And in light of the stress you've been under, and for the minor injuries you sustained, the hospital is prepared to offer you this." Sarah opened the envelope. Inside was a check for $10,000. Attached was a 20-page non-disclosure agreement. "This is a settlement," Albright explained. "It releases the hospital from any and all liability. It also, naturally, requires your complete and total silence on the matter of the collapse, your employment, and any third-party offers of renovation. Sign it, and we can all move on." Sarah looked at the check, then at the lawyer's implacable face. This wasn't a settlement. It was an insult. It was hush money. "You want me to take this money and let you brush Julian Croft's offer under the rug?" "We want you to be a team player," Albright said, her voice losing its faux warmth. "And I'll be blunt. If you continue to pursue this rogue campaign, we will have no choice but to review your employment status. Violating media policy, insubordination, we will find cause for termination, I assure you." Sarah pushed the envelope back across the table. "I'm not signing it." Albright's eyes narrowed. "You're making a grave mistake." The harassment at work escalated immediately. Her schedule was changed again, this time to a chaotic mix of day and night shifts designed to destroy her sleep cycle. She was assigned the most difficult patients. Brenda took to shadowing her, watching her every move, waiting for a mistake. She wrote Sarah up for being 3 minutes late back from a break. She'd overhear Brenda in the nurse's station, her voice just loud enough to carry. "Can you believe the nerve? Trying to get famous off a little accident. Some people will do anything for attention." Her colleagues started to avoid her. Even David, who had helped pull her from the rubble, now just gave her a pained, apologetic look before hurrying away. He had a mortgage. He had kids. He couldn't afford to be seen as an ally of a troublemaker. She was an island, surrounded by a sea of fear and hostility. One evening, leaving after another punishing shift, she found a note tucked under her car's windshield wiper. In crude block letters, it read, "Quit while you're ahead." She sat in her car, the threatening note in her trembling hand, the NDA on her passenger seat, and the weight of it all finally crashed down on her. The miracle had become a nightmare. They had twisted her heroism into a liability, a philanthropist's generosity into a threat, and her advocacy into insubordination. They were going to win. They were going to grind her down until she was nothing but dust, just like the ceiling that had started it all. She leaned her head against the steering wheel, and for the first time since the collapse, she wept. Sarah sat in her dimly lit apartment for hours, the lawyer's threats echoing in her mind. The exhaustion was bone deep, a weariness that went far beyond physical fatigue. They had her trapped. If she kept fighting, she'd be fired, branded a troublemaker, and the project would die anyway. If she gave up, she'd be taking their blood money, silencing the truth, and condemning those kids to that decaying, dangerous ward. Both paths felt like a defeat. She looked at the picture on her phone again, the grainy image of her shielding Leo. She remembered the feeling of his small body trembling beneath hers, the absolute certainty in that moment that nothing else in the world mattered but keeping him safe. What had changed? The danger was no longer falling plaster. It was cynical men in suits, petty supervisors, and the slow, crushing weight of institutional apathy. But the mission was the same. Protect the children. A slow-burning anger began to replace her despair. They thought they could bully her into silence. They underestimated her. They had mistaken her compassion for weakness. With a newfound resolve, she picked up her phone. She didn't call her union rep, who she knew was in the administration's pocket. She called the one person who had treated the story with the gravity it deserved. The journalist from the local news station, a young, hungry reporter named Jessica. "Jessica, it's Sarah Jenkins," she said, her voice steady. "You're not going to believe what's been happening since we last spoke. I think it's time we talked again, and this time I'm bringing receipts." The next day she met Jessica at a quiet coffee shop, a folder thick with documents in her hands. She laid it all out. The board's cynical excuses, the city officials' stonewalling, the threatening NDA, the petty workplace write-ups. Jessica's eyes grew wider with every document. "They're trying to bury you to bury their own negligence," she breathed, her journalistic instincts firing on all cylinders. "This is bigger than a collapsing ceiling. This is a cover-up." But Sarah knew her story alone wasn't enough. They needed the human element. They needed a voice that couldn't be dismissed as a disgruntled employee. She called Leo's mother, Maria Martinez. When she explained the hospital's refusal of Croft's offer, Maria's quiet gratitude transformed into a lioness's roar. "They would rather let our children lie in a crumbling room than admit they were wrong?" Maria said, her voice shaking with rage. "Oh no, they will not be silent about this." Maria agreed to an on-camera interview, and she was devastating. With tears in her eyes, she recounted the terror of the collapse and the depth of her gratitude for Sarah, then transitioned to a powerful, articulate fury at the administration's heartless decision. "They are protecting their budget," she said, looking directly into the camera, "while this woman protected my son with her own body. Who is the real hero here? And who is the villain?" The final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source. The evening before the story was set to air, a plain brown envelope appeared under Sarah's apartment door. Inside, with no note, were photocopies. One was a copy of an internal email from Mr. Davies to Miss Albright, dated the day after Croft's offer. It read, "We need to manage the narrative on this Croft situation, frame him as an opportunist, and Jenkins as an unstable element. Kill this by any means necessary." There were also copies of a dozen other ignored maintenance requests from other nurses for everything from faulty wiring to black mold. Someone on the inside had decided to fight back. The news segment aired at 6 p.m. It was the lead story. Jessica had crafted a masterpiece of investigative journalism, weaving Sarah's calm, factual account with Maria's emotional testimony and the damning evidence of the leaked documents. She had a statement from Julian Croft's office, confirming his offer and expressing his profound disappointment with the hospital's inexplicable resistance. The effect was instantaneous and explosive. The story was picked up by national news outlets within the hour. On social media, the hashtag number #BuildForLeo began to trend. Then came number #StandWithSarahJenkins. People shared the grainy photo of Sarah and Leo, contrasting it with the cold corporate headshot of Mr. Davies. The hospital's Facebook page was flooded with thousands of angry comments. A local legislator announced an immediate inquiry into Northgate General's use of public funds. The wall of bureaucracy that had seemed so impenetrable had been shattered by a single powerful tool, the truth. The public, now aware of the battle being waged in the shadows of their local hospital, had chosen a side, and they were coming for the villains. The public outcry was a tidal wave, and the Northgate General Administration, which had thought itself an unbreachable fortress, was swept away in the deluge. The hospital's main phone lines were jammed with calls from furious citizens. Major corporate donors began publicly announcing they were re-evaluating their relationship with the institution. The story had become a national symbol of corporate greed versus human decency. The hospital's board of directors, a group of wealthy, insulated individuals accustomed to quiet, deferential meetings, was in a full-blown panic. Their emergency session wasn't about whether to accept Croft's offer anymore. It was about survival. The reckoning was swift and merciless. Sarah learned about it not from an official source, but from a triumphant text from her anonymous ally inside. "He's gone." An all-staff email went out an hour later, announcing that Mr. Davies was resigning to pursue other opportunities, effective immediately. It was the oldest corporate cliché for a public execution. The next day, Sarah saw Brenda clearing out her desk at the nurse's station, her face a mask of bitter resentment. She refused to look at Sarah, stuffing personal items into a cardboard box with angry, jerky movements. The official word was that Brenda had been reassigned to a non-patient-facing role at our downtown records facility, a paper-pushing exile from which no career ever recovered. The change in the hospital's atmosphere was palpable. The fear that had hung over the staff was replaced with a giddy sense of liberation. Nurses who had previously avoided Sarah's gaze now gave her small smiles, nods of respect, and quiet words of thanks in the hallways. David clapped her on the shoulder, his face etched with relief. "You did it, Sarah. You actually did it." The final dominoes fell quickly. The city mayor, facing an election year and seeing the direction of the political winds, held a press conference. He announced that he had personally called Julian Croft and that the city was fast-tracking every single permit, waiving all fees, and would do everything in its power to support this wonderful, philanthropic endeavor. The obstructive planning official, Mr. Peters, was suddenly on extended personal leave. 2 weeks later, Sarah found herself standing on a makeshift stage under a brilliant blue sky, a silver-plated shovel in her hand. Beside her stood Julian Croft, looking every bit as elegant and intelligent as he had sounded on the phone. News cameras flashed, and a crowd of hospital staff, parents, and community members applauded. It was the groundbreaking ceremony for the new ward. When it was Croft's turn to speak, he walked to the podium and smiled. Architects like to take credit for their buildings, he began, his voice amplified across the lawn. But every great building begins not with a sketch, but with an idea, a reason to exist. And the reason we are all standing here today is not because of me. It's because of a woman who, in a moment of crisis, reminded us what hospitals are truly for. They are not for profit or prestige. They are for people. The true architect of this new beginning is Nurse Sarah Jenkins. He led the applause, and as Sarah stood there, blinking back tears, she saw Maria and Leo in the front row. Leo was holding a hand-drawn sign that read, "Thank you, Sarah." The new acting hospital administrator, a woman with kind eyes who had already met with Sarah twice, shook her hand and offered her a new role, head nurse of the new wing once it was completed, and a permanent seat on a newly formed patient and staff advocacy committee. It was more than a victory. It was a revolution. 18 months later, the doors to the Julian Croft and Sarah Jenkins pediatric wing officially opened. It was nothing short of a masterpiece. The long, dark corridors of the old ward were gone, replaced by wide, open spaces bathed in natural light from sweeping windows and cleverly designed skylights. The walls were painted in soft, calming colors, adorned with beautiful, interactive murals of forests and oceans created by local artists. The old, cramped 4 bedrooms were now private suites, each with comfortable sleeping accommodations for parents and state-of-the-art medical equipment seamlessly integrated into the design, hidden behind cheerful wood panels. There was a sun-drenched playroom, a quiet library for families, and even a rooftop garden where children who were well enough could feel the sun and breeze. It wasn't just a place to be sick, it was a place to heal. Sarah walked through the new ward on the first official day of operation, her new head nurse ID badge clipped to the pocket of her crisp, clean scrubs. A sense of profound, hard-won peace settled over her. The sounds were different now. The constant, rattling groan of the old building was replaced by the quiet hum of a superior ventilation system. The anxious whispers of parents were softer, their faces less strained, and the beeps of the monitors were just a background rhythm to a new sound, the sound of children's laughter echoing from the playroom. She stopped by a large picture window that overlooked the new garden. Down below, a group of children was being led by a recreational therapist. Among them was Leo Martinez. He was here for a routine checkup, but his breathing was even, his color was good, and he was chasing a butterfly with a playful energy she had never seen in him before. He looked taller, stronger, healthier. He looked happy. As if sensing her presence, he stopped and looked up, his eyes scanning the windows. He found her, and his face broke into a wide, brilliant smile. He waved with both hands, a joyful, uninhibited gesture. Sarah smiled back, a genuine smile that reached her eyes, and raised her hand to wave. The fight had cost her. It had pushed her to the edge of her endurance and her hope. But standing here now, in this sanctuary born from dust and defiance, she knew without a single shred of doubt that it had been worth every scar. She had protected her patient, and in doing so, had helped build a new world for all the ones who would come after him.